When the neighbors opened the door, what they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. October 2021, Houston, Texas. For months, the tenants at City Park 2 at West Oaks Apartments complained of a foul odor. Some thought it was trash. Others believed it came from a dead animal. But no one expected what truly lay behind the walls of apartment 1603. When Harris County deputies finally entered that unit, what they discovered wasn't just heartbreaking, it was horrifying. Inside, they found 3 young boys aged 15, 10, and 7. They were living completely alone. No adult, no supervision, no food, no electricity. And in one of the rooms, a decomposed body. It was the skeletal remains of their 8-year-old brother, Kendrick Lee. He had been dead for nearly a year. The boys had been surviving in that apartment while their mother, Gloria Williams, lived just 15 minutes away with her boyfriend, Brian Coulter. She had moved out in 2019 and never came back. Let that sink in. 3 boys, left on their own, for nearly 3 years. No one from Child Protective Services came. No one from the school system checked in. The older brother, the one who was just 15, had been raising his siblings alone while the body of their brother decayed nearby. He had no one to turn to, so he stayed silent for years. It wasn't until that same teen finally gathered the courage to call 911 that this nightmare came to light. His voice trembled as he told the dispatcher, "Our mom hasn't been back in months. My little brother is dead. His body is in the next room." Deputies raced to the apartment. They couldn't believe what they saw. The boys were malnourished, covered in filth. The home was infested with roaches. The furniture was broken. There was no running water. And in a back bedroom, under a thin blanket, were the bones of Kendrick Lee. His face still showed signs of trauma. A massive injury to the back of his head suggested he died a violent death. How could a mother walk away from this? Why didn't anyone notice? Neighbors admitted they'd seen the kids wandering the complex, asking for food, but they thought someone was watching them. Some thought they were just neglected, not abandoned. Later, the truth emerged. Gloria Williams had knowingly left her children to fend for themselves. But the real monster in this story wasn't just neglect, it was what her boyfriend, Brian Coulter, allegedly did. According to the surviving children, Kendrick had been beaten to death by Coulter right in front of them in November 2020. Gloria didn't call 911. She didn't take the body. She didn't even try to hide what had happened. She simply left. She continued her life as if nothing had happened, posting online, going shopping, celebrating birthdays with Coulter, all while her son starved, suffered, and slept next to their dead brother. When Gloria and Brian were arrested, the details were sickening. Brian Coulter was charged with murder. Gloria Williams was charged with injury to a child by omission and tampering with evidence, for hiding her son's death and abandoning the others. But even those charges barely scratched the surface of what these children endured. The case shocked the nation. It raised serious questions. How did the system miss this? Could Kendrick Lee have been saved? And what kind of mother walks away from her own children and leaves them in a house of horrors? The truth was beginning to unfold. But the deeper investigators looked, the darker the story became. Because this wasn't just a case of neglect. This was a calculated betrayal by the very people meant to protect them. October 24th, 2021. After nearly 3 years of silence, the 15-year-old boy, now the head of the household by default, did something unimaginable. He picked up a phone and dialed 911. The call lasted just a few minutes. But those minutes shattered a horrifying secret that had gone unnoticed for almost 3 years. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher listened carefully as the teen calmly but nervously explained what had been going on. "I've been living here alone with my brothers. Our mom hasn't been here in months. My brother, he's dead. His body's in the room next to us." The dispatcher asked questions, clearly trying to confirm whether this was real or some terrible prank. It was real. And it was worse than anyone expected. Deputies arrived quickly. When they stepped into the unit, they were overwhelmed by the smell. Rot, urine, mildew. There was barely any furniture. Trash covered the floors. There was no food in the fridge. Dirty mattresses were placed directly on the ground. In one room, under a thin gray blanket, they found the body. The skeletal remains were so decomposed The only way to identify the child was through dental records. It was Kendrick Lee. And there, in the middle of all of it, stood the boy who made the call. Thin, dirty, pale. He hadn't been to school in years. He hadn't spoken to another adult outside his home in just as long. But now, with his two younger brothers looking to him, he took the risk. He called for help. Investigators were stunned. The teen told them Kendrick had been dead for nearly a year. He said their mother had left long ago and never returned. She would drop off groceries once in a while. Sometimes, but for the most part, they were on their own. He said Kendrick was beaten to death by their mother's boyfriend, Brian Coulter, right in front of them. No one called for help. No one checked on them. The body stayed there, rotting, while the boys learned to live with it, eating snacks, charging stolen phones at nearby stores, begging neighbors for food. The boy who made the call had also taken care of his brothers. He protected them, fed them what he could, and every night he closed the door to the room where his brother's remains lay, hoping he'd have the courage to speak up. And now he had. News of the discovery spread fast. The Houston public was outraged. How could this happen in an apartment complex surrounded by other families? How did Child Protective Services not notice the kids had vanished from school? Why didn't the system flag this when Gloria Williams stopped showing up for scheduled appointments? Neighbors came forward. Some said they'd seen the boys around the complex, hungry, asking for snacks or water. One woman even said she gave them food a few times. Another admitted the boys looked dirty and tired, but they assumed their mom worked night shifts or was just neglectful, not missing. None of them imagined the boys were alone. None imagined a child had died there. CPS launched an investigation. They admitted they had no prior history with the family, meaning no reports, no visits, no checks. The system had failed them completely. Meanwhile, Gloria Williams and Brian Coulter were located within hours. They were living together in a different apartment in the Houston area. They were eating well, dressing clean, posting selfies online. From the outside, they looked like a normal couple, but behind closed doors, they had abandoned 3 boys and ignored a dead one. When deputies interviewed Gloria, her answers were shocking. She admitted Kendrick had died sometime in November 2020. She also admitted that she knew his body was still in the apartment with her other children, but said she was too afraid to report it. Brian Coulter, when questioned, confessed to beating Kendrick to death. He said he lost control. Kendrick was acting out, and he struck him over and over. There was no apology, no breakdown, no remorse. Authorities arrested Coulter and charged him with murder. Gloria was charged with injury to a child by omission, failure to provide care, and tampering with evidence. But the damage was already done. Kendrick was gone. 3 other boys had suffered years of trauma. And the entire nation was asking, how did this go on for so long, without anyone noticing? The boy who called 911 had saved his brothers, but no one saved him. She called herself a mother. He called it discipline. But what they left behind was something only monsters could justify. As news of the abandoned boys made headlines, so did the names Gloria Williams and Brian Coulter. Gloria, 35 years old at the time, had been a mother of 6. But in the public eye, she became something much darker, the woman who turned her back on her children and covered up a murder. And then there was Brian Coulter, a man with no biological connection to the children, yet someone with absolute control over their lives for years. Now all eyes were on them. When Gloria was arrested, detectives expected tears, a breakdown, a mother trying to explain the unexplainable. But Gloria wasn't crying. In fact, when she was first questioned, she gave vague, emotionless answers. She admitted Kendrick was dead. She said she was scared to go to the police. She claimed Brian had just lost it and beat Kendrick in front of her. And she stayed. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She left her other 3 children in the same apartment with the body still in the room. She said she came back now and then, dropped off food, checked on them. But there was no parenting, no protection, just long silences and longer absences. She also admitted she never tried to remove Kendrick's body. She knew it was decomposing. She knew her children were living with the smell, the bugs, and the trauma. But she did nothing. Then Brian Coulter's interview began. Unlike Gloria, Brian didn't try to deny what happened. He admitted hitting Kendrick repeatedly, in the face, in the back of the head. He claimed Kendrick was misbehaving. He said he snapped. He described the beating with calm, even casual words, like it was just another day. But when Kendrick stopped moving and they realized he was dead, Brian didn't try CPR. He didn't call 911. He didn't even panic. He and Gloria simply walked away, left the body in the room, shut the door, and moved into a new apartment, together. For nearly a year, they lived like nothing had happened. They bought groceries, they posted photos, they even celebrated birthdays, while Kendrick's remains lay just miles away, decomposing next to his brothers. The public response was immediate and explosive. Outrage swept through social media. Thousands of people demanded justice for Kendrick and his siblings. Protesters gathered outside the apartment complex, leaving candles and stuffed animals at the building's entrance. Online, people asked how the system failed so badly. How could no one notice these boys were missing from school? Why didn't the neighbors do more? Where were the social workers? And most importantly, why didn't Gloria protect her own children? As the case gained national attention, prosecutors filed charges swiftly. Brian Coulter, charged with murder, with a possible life sentence. Gloria Williams, charged with injury to a child by omission, tampering with a human corpse, and failure to report a death. But for many, even those charges felt like too little, too late. Doctors evaluated the 3 surviving boys. All were severely malnourished. They had signs of long-term neglect. One boy had untreated injuries. Another showed signs of PTSD. They were placed in protective custody. Slowly, with help from trauma specialists, they began to speak about what they had seen and how they had survived. The 15-year-old who made the 911 call became a symbol of quiet bravery. Without him, his brothers might not have survived another month. He fed them with food he could beg or borrow. He kept them clean as best he could. He stayed inside most days to protect them. He watched his little brother's body rot and still managed to hold on to hope. He was a child, but he acted like a parent. And for 3 long years, no one saw him. No one helped. No one asked the right questions. The blame didn't fall on Gloria and Brian alone. The system, schools, child welfare agencies, law enforcement had all missed the signs. And those signs were everywhere. This was more than a murder case. This was a collapse of everything meant to protect the most vulnerable. But the question still lingered. How did it start? Because behind every broken child is a longer, darker story. And the next chapter would uncover the roots of a life filled with warning signs and choices that led straight to tragedy. This wasn't just a failure. It was a slow, silent collapse. And every warning was ignored until it was far too late. To understand how Gloria Williams abandoned her children, how 3 boys ended up living alone with the corpse of their brother, we must go back before the murder, before the silence, before anyone dialed 911. This tragedy didn't begin in one moment. It unraveled over time, through signs, red flags, and quiet cries for help that were ignored. Gloria Williams was known in some circles as a single mother trying to get by. She had multiple children from different fathers, and according to neighbors and acquaintances, her parenting had always seemed unstable. People described her as quiet, but also distant. She kept her kids out of sight. Some reported seeing them late at night walking alone. Others said they looked hungry, thin and dirty. One school worker later admitted Kendrick Lee and his siblings were registered at a Houston area school years earlier, but sometime around 2019 they stopped attending. No one followed up. No social worker visited the home. No truancy officer knocked on the door. The school district had no documented contact with the family after that, and that's where the cracks in the system began to widen. Then came Brian Coulter. Gloria began dating him in 2019, the same year she vanished from her children's lives. Court documents later revealed Brian had a history of violence. He'd had run-ins with law enforcement, though never for anything quite like what he was about to do. Once Brian entered the picture, everything changed. He reportedly disliked Kendrick Lee, the 8-year-old victim. The surviving brothers told authorities that Brian often targeted Kendrick, calling him names, mocking him, hitting him. Kendrick was described as the sweetest by family friends. Quiet, shy, always trying to stay out of the way. But that didn't save him. In November 2020, the boys say Brian snapped. He beat Kendrick in the head until he stopped breathing. And Gloria did nothing. She didn't intervene. She didn't call for help. She didn't even shield her other children from the horror. Instead, she let Kendrick die, then walked out of the apartment and left the others behind. For months, she returned only occasionally, dropping off canned food, instant noodles or juice, never staying long, never taking them with her. When questioned later, she said she was scared of Brian, that he controlled her. But prosecutors saw it differently. She wasn't just scared, she was complicit. Many neighbors later told investigators that they suspected something wasn't right. They noticed the boys were always together, that no adults ever came and went. Some claimed they saw the boys digging through garbage cans. One woman said she gave them food a few times, but no one called the police. No one raised alarms. They assumed the kids were neglected, but not abandoned, and certainly not living with a dead sibling. In hindsight, every little detail became a clue, a moment that could have changed everything. If one teacher had checked on their disappearance, if one neighbor had called in a tip, if one social worker had made a visit, but no one did, and the boys kept surviving, alone, until the 15-year-old brother, after 331 days of silence, picked up the phone and changed everything. As the investigation deepened, both Gloria Williams and Brian Coulter faced the full weight of the law. Coulter remained in custody on murder charges with no bond. Williams, arrested shortly after, was given a $1.5 million bond and charged with injury to a child by omission, failure to report a death, and tampering with a corpse. Her attorney argued she was manipulated by Brian, that she was a victim too, but the evidence said otherwise. She had multiple opportunities to save her kids, to call for help, to tell someone, but instead she let them suffer for nearly 3 years, and her silence was deadly. Still, the courts moved slowly, motions, hearings, delays. But while Gloria and Brian waited behind bars, the boys were finally safe, in foster care, together. And for the first time in years, they had food, they had clean clothes, they had adults who cared. But the scars ran deep. One boy still woke up screaming. Another refused to speak about the room. And the teen who had carried the weight of the world barely smiled. They had survived hell, but the trauma would take a lifetime to heal. They lived in the shadows for 3 years, but now the world knows their names, their pain, and their strength. By the time the courtroom doors closed behind Gloria Williams and Brian Coulter, a broken family had already endured more pain than most could imagine. 3 boys had survived years of hunger, a home filled with silence and fear, the constant presence of their brother's decaying body, and worst of all, being forgotten by everyone who was supposed to care. Now, in the aftermath of national outrage, investigations and court hearings, these boys were no longer invisible. They were survivors. Brian Coulter, the man accused of brutally murdering 8-year-old Kendrick Lee, remained in jail charged with murder. His face became synonymous with cruelty, cold, smiling in a mugshot, a man who took a child's life and walked away. His legal team tried to argue mental instability, but prosecutors pushed forward with a charge that could land him in prison for life without parole. Gloria Williams, on the other hand, was a puzzle the public couldn't easily solve. Was she a weak woman manipulated by an abusive partner? Or was she a mother who turned her back and chose comfort over her own children? The courts leaned toward the latter. Her charges, injury to a child, failing to report a death, and tampering with a corpse, could carry decades in prison. But more than punishment, the public wanted accountability, because in the end, Gloria made a choice. She walked away. The surviving children were placed into long-term care, not split up, not isolated, together, finally. Their identities were kept hidden for their protection. But court-appointed therapists, foster guardians, and child advocates began to share glimpses of their recovery. The 15-year-old who had raised his siblings and finally called 911 was described as protective, mature, and deeply traumatized. He still wouldn't talk much about the night Kendrick died, but he was reading again, sleeping again, laughing sometimes. His younger brothers, once hollow-eyed and sickly, were slowly returning to life. With counseling and the right care, they were eating full meals, drawing pictures, and learning how to play again. But healing wasn't instant. It would take years to untangle the pain, the neglect, the betrayal. Years to rebuild trust in adults, in the system, and even in themselves. Beyond the courtroom, people demanded real change. How could no one notice 3 missing children? How did a mother remove her kids from school with no consequences? Why didn't Child Protective Services ever intervene? Lawmakers called for reviews. Schools were asked to flag long-term absences more aggressively.